I've been lurking here for a while, but finally decided to share something that's been weighing on me for years. I'm Jake, 32 now, but the story starts way back when I was just a kid. I'm hoping for some perspective because I've been struggling to piece together how my childhood shaped the person I've become. When I was 5, my younger sister Amanda was born, and my entire world flipped upside down. Up until then, life was pretty great. My parents weren't perfect or anything, but they doted on me. I remember my mom reading me fairy tales before bed. She always made the voices so vivid and funny, and my dad taking me out to the park to play baseball. They made me feel like I was the center of their world. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm and predictable, like I belonged. Then Amanda came along. I don't know if my parents planned on having her or if she was a surprise, but from the moment she arrived, it was like someone flipped a switch. Suddenly, everything revolved around her. At first, I didn't mind. I was 5 and I thought babies were kind of cool. I even helped out, handing my mom diapers or trying to entertain Amanda when she cried. I guess I figured it was just temporary, like they'd eventually start paying attention to me again once the new baby excitement wore off. But it didn't. Over time, it became clear that Amanda wasn't just the new baby. She was the baby, the favorite. My parents treated her like she was made of gold. They fawned over every little thing she did, like when she said her first word or took her first steps, while everything I did seemed to fade into the background. I'd come home from kindergarten with a picture I was proud of, and they'd barely glance at it before turning back to Amanda. "Oh, that's nice, Jake," they'd say, but their attention was always somewhere else. The traditions we had, bedtime stories, baseball in the park, family movie nights, all stopped. My dad would tell me he was too tired to throw the ball around, but the next minute, he'd be crawling on the floor with Amanda, making her laugh. My mom stopped reading to me, saying I was old enough to read on my own. She didn't even try to hide the fact that Amanda had become her whole world. I remember once overhearing her on the phone with her sister, gushing about how Amanda was so special and such a blessing. I waited for her to say something about me, but she never did. I started to resent Amanda. I know that's awful to say because it wasn't her fault, but I couldn't help it. Felt like she'd stolen my parents from me. I tried to get their attention in other ways, getting good grades, behaving well, even helping out around the house, but nothing seemed to make a difference. If Amanda threw a tantrum, they'd drop everything to comfort her. If I got upset, they'd tell me to stop being dramatic or to figure it out myself. The worst part was how obvious it was to everyone. Even relatives noticed. My grandma, who used to spoil me with little treats, started giving Amanda extra gifts and saying things like, "She's such a little angel." Once, at a family gathering, my uncle joked, "Jake, better get used to being in the shadow of the golden child." Everyone laughed, but I wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Looking back, I think that was when I started to retreat into myself. I spent more time in my room, reading or playing with my toys alone. My parents didn't seem to notice or care. Amanda became the center of their universe, and I became a background character in my own family. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I wonder, did I do something wrong? Was I just not good enough? Or was this just how things were always going to be? As soon as I graduated high school, I knew I had to get out. The suffocation of living in a house where I felt like a ghost had become unbearable. Amanda was still the golden child, the center of everything, and I was just there. I figured if my parents weren't going to notice me while I was home, they wouldn't miss me when I was gone. So I made a plan. I chose a university 1,000 kilometers away, partly because they offered a decent program for what I wanted to study and partly because it was far enough to feel like a fresh start. I didn't tell my parents about my choice. Honestly, I didn't even think they'd ask, and I was right. The few times they brought up my post-high school plans, it was always in a distracted, half-interested way, like they were asking out of obligation. My dad would say, "So, you're going to college, right?" while scrolling on his phone, and my mom would jump in with something about Amanda's latest piano recital or her amazing grades. I'd just nod and let the conversation die because, really, what was the point? When the time came to move, I packed up everything myself and took a bus to campus. It was surreal. No send-off, no hugs, no "we're so proud of you." Just me and a couple of suitcases. Amanda didn't even say goodbye, but I wasn't surprised. She was busy prepping for some big debate competition, and my parents were, as usual, wrapped up in her world. For all I know, they might not have even noticed I'd left until days later. Starting over was harder than I expected. I didn't have much money, so I picked up a job as a waiter at a diner near campus to cover my expenses. Juggling work and classes wasn't easy, but it felt good to be in control of my own life, even if it meant barely scraping by. I lived on instant noodles, cheap coffee, and sheer determination. It wasn't glamorous, but for the first time, I felt like I was building something for myself. I didn't go home for the holidays either. At first, I told myself it was because I couldn't afford the trip, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The idea of sitting at the dinner table while my parents fawned over Amanda's latest achievements made me sick to my stomach. I started making excuses, extra shifts at work, too much homework, anything to avoid going back. I think my parents noticed eventually, but they didn't push. They sent the occasional text asking how I was doing, but it always felt like an afterthought, like they were ticking a box on some invisible checklist. Amanda, of course, was thriving. Every now and then, my mom would send me updates about her, how she'd won some award or gotten into some exclusive program. I'd read the messages and feel a weird mix of pride and bitterness. I wanted to be happy for her, but I couldn't shake the resentment that had been brewing in me for years. It felt like every one of her successes was just another reminder of how I'd never measured up in their eyes. The distance helped, though. Being away from them gave me room to breathe, to figure out who I was outside of the shadow Amanda cast over my childhood. I made a few friends at school, worked hard, and tried to focus on my own goals. For the first time in my life, I wasn't constantly comparing myself to her or vying for attention I'd never get. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Still, there were nights when I'd lie awake in my tiny dorm room and wonder if I'd made a mistake. Was it normal for a family to be so disconnected? Or was I the problem? Those thoughts never lasted long, though. I'd remind myself that I was better off where I was, far away from a home that never really felt like one. I'll never forget the night Amanda called me. It was late, and I just finished a double shift at the diner. I was exhausted, my feet ached, and I was about 2 seconds away from crashing into bed when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, but when I saw Amanda's name on the screen, I hesitated. She never called me, not once in all the years since I'd left home. For a second, I thought something terrible must have happened, and I answered. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. It was like the words were stuck in her throat, coming out in choked gasps between the tears. "They kicked me out," she managed to say after a while. "Mom and Dad. They kicked me out." I didn't know what to say. Took me a second to even process what she meant. "Wait, what? What are you talking about?" It all came spilling out in a rush. She told me that she'd been dating a girl for a few months and finally decided to tell our parents. She thought they'd be upset, but that they'd come around eventually. Instead, they completely lost it. My mom had screamed at her, calling her all kinds of names I couldn't even imagine coming out of her mouth, while my dad told her to pack her things and leave. They didn't give her a chance to explain or defend herself. They just shut her out completely. By the time she finished, I was stunned. As much as I resented our parents, I never thought they'd go that far. Sure, they had their favorites, and yeah, they'd always been strict about appearances and expectations, but this, kicking their own daughter out, it was like a whole new level of coldness I hadn't seen before. "I don't know what to do," Amanda said, her voice cracking. "I have nowhere to go." I took a deep breath. "Come here," I said before I could think twice. "You can stay with me for a while." It wasn't like I had the space. My apartment was tiny, just a one-bedroom I could barely afford on my waiter's salary. But I couldn't leave her out on the street. No matter how much resentment I still carried from our childhood, she was my sister. The next morning, Amanda showed up at my door with a couple of bags and a look on her face I'd never seen before. She looked broken. Amanda had always been the confident one, the golden child who could do no wrong. Seeing her like that felt strange, like it flipped the dynamic we'd had our entire lives. I hugged her, awkwardly at first, and let her inside. The first couple of days were tense. We didn't talk much beyond the basics, how long she could stay, where she'd put her stuff, things like that. I wasn't sure how to act around her, and I think she felt the same. There was so much history between us, so much unspoken resentment, that we didn't even know where to start. But slowly, things started to thaw. She helped me out around the apartment, cooked dinner a few times, and even insisted on chipping in for groceries with what little money she had. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me realize she was trying. One night, about 2 weeks after she moved in, we ended up staying up late talking. I don't even remember how it started, but before I knew it, we were sharing stories about our childhood. For the first time ever, we were completely honest with each other. I told her how invisible I'd felt growing up, how it seemed like our parents only had eyes for her. I told her about the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering what was wrong with me, and how leaving for college was the only way I could breathe again. Amanda listened quietly, tears in her eyes. When I was done, she said, "Jake, I didn't know. I knew things weren't perfect between us, but I didn't realize it was that bad." Then she told me her side of the story, and it hit me like a truck. She said our parents' attention wasn't the blessing it seemed like. Sure, they doted on her and praised her for everything she did, but it came with a price. They expected perfection from her, and anything less was unacceptable. She told me about the times she'd stay up all night studying for tests because she couldn't handle the pressure of disappointing them. She talked about the panic attacks she hid from everyone, the constant fear of not living up to their expectations, and how it felt like she couldn't be herself around them. When I told them about Emily, she said, referring to her girlfriend, it wasn't just about being gay. It was about finally standing up for myself, finally saying, "This is who I am," and they couldn't handle it. I didn't know what to say. For so long, I'd seen her as this golden child who had everything handed to her, who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. I never realized how much she was suffering under the weight of their expectations. We talked for hours that night, laying everything out in the open. It didn't fix everything. We still had years of resentment and misunderstanding to work through. But it was a start. For the first time, I felt like we weren't just siblings in name. We were finally seeing each other for who we really were. It was strange. I'd spent so much of my life resenting Amanda for being the favorite, and now here she was, just as broken as I'd felt all those years. Our parents had failed us both in different ways, and it took her being kicked out for us to finally realize that we weren't so different after all. A few months after Amanda moved in, things seemed to be stabilizing. She'd gotten a part-time job, and although she wasn't fully back to her usual self, I thought she was doing better. We still had nights where we talk about the past, but there were also moments of laughter and small signs of healing. It felt like we were finally finding a rhythm. Then one night, everything came crashing down. I came home late from a shift at the diner to find the apartment empty. Amanda's shoes weren't by the door, and her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter. At first, I figured she'd just gone out for a walk or to grab something from the store. But as the hours ticked by and she didn't come back, I started to worry. I called her phone over and over, but obviously, she wasn't answering. By midnight, I was pacing the living room, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Around 2 a.m., my phone rang. When I saw an unknown number on the screen, my stomach dropped. I answered, my voice shaking, and heard the calm, professional tone of a police officer on the other end. "Is this Jake Miller?" "Yes," I said, barely able to get the word out. "We have your sister, Amanda Miller, here with us. She's been taken to the hospital after an incident in the park." "Incident?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what they meant. My knees felt like they were going to give out. "She appears to have attempted to harm herself, but she was found in time. She's stable, but you should come to the hospital right away." The drive to the hospital felt like it lasted an eternity. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly they went numb. I couldn't stop thinking about Amanda, how she'd seemed to be doing better, how I'd missed the signs that something was wrong. By the time I got there, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. When I saw her, lying in that hospital bed, pale and hooked up to monitors, I felt a wave of emotions I can't even begin to describe. Relief that she was alive, guilt that I hadn't seen this coming, and anger at our parents, at the world, at myself, for letting things get to this point. Amanda was barely conscious when I sat down beside her. Her wrists were bandaged, and there were tear stains on her cheeks. She looked so small, so fragile, like a shadow of the person I'd grown up with. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Don't you dare apologize," I said. "I'm the one who should have seen it. I should have done more." She closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. I couldn't take it anymore," she said after a long pause. "I feel like I've been living my whole life trying to be someone I'm not, trying to make them proud, trying to be perfect, and it's never enough. I'm never enough." Hearing her say that broke something inside me. All those years I'd spent thinking she had it easy, resenting her for being the favorite, and now I realized how much pain she'd been carrying. She wasn't perfect. She was human, just like me, and she'd been crushed under the weight of our parents' impossible expectations. The doctors said she was lucky. If the jogger who found her in the park had been a few minutes later, she might not have made it. That thought haunted me for weeks. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head, imagining what could have happened if things had gone differently. I called our parents that night, not because I wanted their help, but because I thought they deserved to know what had happened. My mom answered, and when I told her, there was this long silence. For a moment, I thought she was crying, but then she said, "Why would she do something so selfish?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Selfish," I snapped. "She's been trying to live up to your impossible standards her whole life. You pushed her to the edge, and now you have the nerve to call her selfish." My mom started to defend herself, saying they'd only ever wanted the best for Amanda, but I hung up before she could finish. I didn't even bother calling my dad. I knew exactly what he'd say, that it was Amanda's fault for not being strong enough, that she should have handled things differently. They didn't come to the hospital. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. That was the last straw for me. I realized then that there was no fixing things with our parents. They'd never change, never take responsibility for the way they'd hurt us. I told Amanda they weren't coming, and although she didn't say anything, the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She'd been holding on to some tiny shred of hope that they might show up, that they might care. When they didn't, it shattered whatever was left of her faith in them. After that, I made the decision to cut them out of my life completely. I blocked their numbers, unfriended them on social media, and stopped answering the occasional messages they sent. It wasn't easy. It felt like I was closing the door on the possibility of ever having a real family, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Amanda and I deserved better. The weeks that followed were tough. Amanda started therapy, and I did my best to support her, even though I was still dealing with my own emotions. There were days when she barely got out of bed, and nights when I'd hear her crying in her room. But slowly, little by little, she began to heal. One night, as we sat on the couch watching some terrible sitcom, she turned to me and said, "Thanks for not giving up on me." I looked at her, my little sister who'd been through so much, and said, "You're stuck with me, Amanda, no matter what." It wasn't perfect, and I knew we both had a long way to go. But for the first time, it felt like we were in this together, two people trying to build a new kind of family from the ashes of the one that had failed us. After everything that happened, Amanda and I decided we needed a fresh start. It was a mutual decision, unspoken at first but eventually becoming something we both admitted out loud. We couldn't keep living in the shadow of our past. It was time to build something new, something that was entirely ours. We pooled what little savings we had and found a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of the city. It wasn't much. Old carpet, creaky windows, and a bathroom that constantly needed fixing. But it felt like a safe haven. For the first time, we weren't just surviving. We were trying to create a life that felt like ours. To pay the bills, we took whatever jobs we could find. I landed an entry-level office job doing data entry, and Amanda worked at a customer service call center. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave us stability. We'd come home after long days, tired but determined to make things better. Some nights we'd sit at the kitchen table eating cheap takeout, talking about what we wanted for the future. Those conversations eventually led to an idea, a big one. Amanda brought it up first, hesitantly at first, like she wasn't sure if I'd take it seriously. "What if we started our own business?" she asked one night, her voice tinged with excitement but also a bit of doubt. "Something meaningful, something that helps people." I laughed at first, thinking it was just one of those pie-in-the-sky ideas you toss around when you're daydreaming. But the more we talked about it, the more it started to make sense. We'd both seen how hard it was for small businesses and nonprofits to thrive, especially when they didn't have the resources to compete with bigger companies. What if we could use our skills to help them? It wasn't like we had much experience. My office job had given me some exposure to marketing, and Amanda had a knack for design and communication. But we figured we could learn as we went. So, with a mix of determination, naivety, and a whole lot of caffeine, we dove in headfirst. The early days were brutal. We both kept our day jobs while trying to build the business on the side, which meant working 20-hour days more often than not. We'd come home, open our laptops, and spend hours researching, planning, and reaching out to potential clients. There were nights we barely slept, surviving on instant coffee and sheer willpower. At first, it felt like we were screaming into the void. We'd send out dozens of emails, make cold calls, and pitch our services to anyone who would listen, only to hear no again and again. There were moments when I wondered if we'd made a huge mistake, if we'd bitten off more than we could chew. But then, slowly, things started to change. We landed our first client, a local bakery struggling to compete with a big chain that had just opened down the street. The owner was hesitant at first, but when we helped her revamp her social media and run a few targeted ads, her sales started to pick up. Seeing her excitement, hearing her say, "You've saved my business," was like a shot of pure adrenaline. That first win gave us the confidence to keep going. Word spread, and soon we were working with a handful of small businesses and nonprofits in the area. Each project was a learning experience, and we poured everything we had into making sure our clients were happy. The workload was insane. There were weeks when we barely left the apartment, buried under deadlines and juggling a dozen tasks at once. But for the first time, the exhaustion felt worth it. We weren't just working to survive, we were building something we believed in, something that mattered. Amanda was a force of nature. She handled the creative side of things, designing logos, crafting marketing campaigns, and coming up with innovative ideas that I never would have thought of. I focused on the strategy and logistics, making sure our projects stayed on track and our clients were happy. We made a good team, balancing each other out in a way that felt natural. There were setbacks, of course. Clients who didn't pay on time, campaigns that didn't go as planned, and moments when it felt like we were drowning in work. But every time we hit a roadblock, we found a way to push through. One night, after we just wrapped up a big project for a local animal shelter, Amanda turned to me and said, "I'm proud of us." Caught me off guard, and I realized I hadn't really stopped to think about how far we'd come. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were thriving in our own way. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of our past crept in. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were in control of our lives. We were no longer defined by our parents' expectations or the scars of our childhood. We were building something that was entirely ours, and that was enough to keep us going. Life had finally started to feel stable. Amanda and I had poured everything we had into building our marketing agency, and it was starting to pay off. We had clients who trusted us, a growing reputation in the community, and for the first time in years, I felt like things were looking up. But of course, life has a way of throwing curveballs just when you least expect them. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those days where everything seemed to be running smoothly. Amanda was out meeting a client, and I was at the office, catching up on emails and trying to finalize a campaign proposal. Then the door opened, and in walked someone I hadn't seen in years. Aunt Linda. Linda was my mom's younger sister, though the word younger felt generous. She was only 10 years older than me, and I'd always thought of her more as a chaotic older cousin than an actual aunt. Growing up, she'd been around a lot, always stirring up drama at family gatherings or telling wildly inappropriate jokes. She and my mom had a strained relationship, and after I left home, I'd barely heard anything about her. Linda, I said, standing up from my desk. What are you doing here? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the door behind her, crossed her arms, and gave me this look that immediately put me on edge. Something was off. She wasn't the fun, slightly messy Linda I remembered. Her expression was cold, calculating, like she'd been rehearsing what she was about to say. We need to talk, she said, her voice low and sharp. Okay, I said cautiously, gesturing for her to sit down. What's going on? She didn't sit. Instead, she pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then held it up in front of me. On the screen was a photo of an ultrasound. This is your problem, she said. I blinked, completely confused. What are you talking about? You're the father, Jake. Don't play dumb. I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. What the hell are you talking about? I haven't seen you in years. Linda scoffed, like I just told her the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. That's convenient, she said. You think you can just deny it and make this go away? I've got proof, Jake. DNA doesn't lie. I was so shocked I actually laughed, which probably wasn't the best reaction. Linda, I don't know what game you're playing, but this is insane. We haven't even been in the same room in... What? 5 years? 6? 7? She snapped. And that's irrelevant. You and I both know what happened at your parents' anniversary party. I froze. My parents' anniversary party. 7 years ago. It was one of the last times I'd seen my family before cutting ties with them completely. I remembered the party clearly, mainly because it was a disaster. My parents had spent the whole night bragging about Amanda while barely acknowledging my existence. And I'd left early, angry and humiliated. I didn't even remember talking to Linda that night, let alone whatever she was implying. This is ridiculous, I said firmly. I didn't sleep with you, Linda. I didn't even talk to you at that party. Don't lie to me, she hissed. You think I'd come here without proof? I have texts, Jake. And if you don't want this to blow up in your face, you're going to pay me what I'm owed. What you're owed? I repeated, completely baffled. $150,000, she said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Call it alimony, child support, whatever you want. I don't care. But if you don't pay, I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. Your clients, your community, everyone. I stared at her, completely stunned. This had to be some kind of joke, right? Some twisted prank? But the look on her face told me she was dead serious. You're out of your mind, I said. You know damn well this baby isn't mine. And if you think you can blackmail me... Blackmail? She interrupted, her voice rising. I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing, Jake. Don't make me take this to court. You know how these things look. All it takes is an accusation, and your reputation's ruined. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just absurd, it was malicious. She was trying to destroy everything Amanda and I had worked so hard to build. And for what? Quick payday. Get out, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. You're making a big mistake, Jake. I'll give you a week to think about it. After that, the gloves come off. She turned and walked out, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. When Amanda got back later that afternoon, I told her everything. She was just as shocked as I was, but also furious. This is insane, she said. She's lying. She has to be. Of course she's lying, I said. The question is, why? What's her angle? We spent the rest of the night trying to piece together what could have led to this. Had she fallen out with our parents and needed money? Was she trying to use me as some kind of scapegoat for her own problems? None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. We couldn't let her get away with this. Over the next few days, I started digging. I went through my old messages, my social media, anything that could prove I hadn't had any contact with Linda in years. I even considered hiring a lawyer, just in case she followed through on her threats. But as much as I wanted to fight back, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. Linda might have been lying, but she was right about one thing. Accusations like this could ruin everything. All it would take was one rumor, one whisper in the wrong ear, and Amanda and I could lose everything we'd worked so hard to build. It was a nightmare, and I had no idea how it was going to end. The days following Linda's threats were some of the most stressful of my life. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, and barely ate. Amanda kept telling me we'd figure it out, but I could see the worry etched on her face. We both knew how fragile our business still was, and Linda's accusations had the potential to destroy everything. The first thing I did was hire a lawyer. It wasn't cheap, but I knew I couldn't handle this on my own. The lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, was calm, professional, and confident from the start. He assured me that as long as I was telling the truth, we had nothing to worry about. "She has no real evidence," he said during our first meeting. "If this goes to court, the burden of proof is on her. And if she's lying, we'll prove it." The first step was to request a DNA test. Linda had been vague about her supposed proof, but she kept claiming she had texts and other evidence to back up her story. When my lawyer formally requested that she provide these so-called messages, her tone shifted. She started stalling, coming up with excuses about why she couldn't hand them over right away. It was clear she was bluffing, but I knew we still needed the DNA test to settle the matter definitively. The court hearing came faster than I expected, and walking into that courtroom was one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. Linda was there, sitting with her lawyer, and the smug expression on her face made my blood boil. She looked completely unbothered, like she thought she had already won. When the judge ordered the DNA test, Linda's confidence started to waver. She tried to argue that it wasn't necessary, claiming she had enough evidence without it. But the judge wasn't buying it. A week later, the results came back. I wasn't the father. I already knew the truth, but seeing it in black and white felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But it wasn't over yet. During the proceedings, Linda's lies started to unravel. Under questioning, she admitted that she was having financial problems. It turned out she'd gotten into debt with her real partner, who had walked out on her when she couldn't pay up. Desperate for money, she decided to pin the pregnancy on me, thinking I'd be too scared to fight back. Her plan completely backfired. Not only did the court rule in my favor, but they also found her guilty of defamation and attempted blackmail. She was ordered to pay me compensation, though I doubted I'd ever see a dime of it. More importantly, her reputation was ruined. News of the trial spread quickly, and the small community where she'd been living turned its back on her. I heard through the grapevine that Linda packed up and left town shortly after the trial ended. I didn't know where she went, and I didn't care. As far as I was concerned, she was out of my life for good. When Amanda and I got back to the apartment after the verdict, we sat in silence for a while, letting the reality of it sink in. Then Amanda broke the silence with a laugh. Quiet at first, then louder until she was doubled over. "What's so funny?" I asked, confused. She wiped a tear from her eye and said, "I mean, of all the things we've been through, I never thought we'd end up in court because Aunt Linda tried to scam you into fatherhood." Despite everything, I couldn't help but laugh, too. It was absurd, completely ridiculous. But it was also over, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The trial didn't just clear my name, it reinforced something important. Amanda and I had built a life we could be proud of, one that wasn't tied to our parents or the chaos of our past. And no matter what curveballs life threw at us, we knew we could face them together. Linda's attempt to tear us down only made us stronger. It was a bitter lesson, but one that proved we were capable of handling whatever came our way. From then on, I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone drag me back into the darkness of the past. Not my parents, not Linda, and certainly not anyone who thought they could take advantage of us. We had worked too hard to let anyone take it away. And as I looked at Amanda, laughing beside me on that old, worn-out couch, I knew we were going to be okay. Life moved forward as it always does. After everything Amanda and I had been through, the fallout with our parents, the trial with Aunt Linda, and all the struggles of building our business, we were finally starting to see the fruits of our hard work. Our marketing agency was thriving in ways I never could have imagined when we first started. We landed a few high-profile clients, and word of mouth kept bringing in new ones. Before we knew it, we were hiring employees and opening a second office in a neighboring city. Amanda, always the dreamer, suggested we create a program to support young talents, especially those who didn't have the resources or connections to get started in the industry. "We know what it's like to feel like the odds are stacked against you," she said one evening, while we brainstormed the program's details over pizza in the office. "Let's be the people we wish we had when we were younger." The program took off faster than we expected. We brought in interns, partnered with local schools, and held workshops for small business owners and nonprofits. Seeing those young people step through our doors, excited, nervous, hopeful, reminded me of why we started this business in the first place. We weren't just making money, we were making a difference. Still, as much as our successes brought joy, there was a part of me that couldn't quite shake the weight of the past. No matter how far I'd come, there was a piece of me that still felt like the neglected boy sitting in his childhood bedroom, wondering why he wasn't enough. That weight came crashing back one day when my parents showed up at my office unannounced. It had been years since I'd seen them. The last time we spoke was after Amanda's suicide attempt, when I called to tell them what had happened and they responded with cold indifference. Cutting them out of my life had been one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but I knew it was necessary. So when they walked through the doors of our office, I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. My receptionist, clearly unaware of the history between us, escorted them into my office with a polite smile. I stood there, unsure of what to say, as my mom and dad, older, grayer, and visibly uncomfortable, sat down across from me. "Jake," my mom began, her voice hesitant. We've been thinking about everything. About the way we treated you. About Amanda." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "We know we failed you. Both of you." I didn't say anything. I just stared at them, waiting. My dad, always the quieter one, spoke next. "We want to apologize," he said, "for not being there for you, for making you feel like you didn't matter. We didn't realize how much we hurt you." There was a time when I would have given anything to hear those words. A time when I dreamed of them admitting their mistakes, apologizing, and making things right. But now, sitting across from them in the office I'd built with Amanda, I didn't feel relief or closure. I felt tired. I took a deep breath, leaning back in my chair. "I appreciate you coming here to say that," I said finally. "But an apology doesn't erase everything. It doesn't change the years of neglect or the fact that Amanda nearly didn't survive because of the pressure you put on her." My mom's eyes filled with tears, and my dad looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm glad you've realized what you did wrong," I continued. "But I've spent years trying to heal from the damage you caused. I've built a life, one I'm proud of, and I've done it without you. I don't think I need anything from you anymore." They sat there for a moment, stunned into silence. My mom opened her mouth to say something but then stopped, as if she knew there was nothing she could say that would fix this. "Jake, we want to make things right," she said finally. "We don't expect you to forgive us overnight, but we'd like a chance to be part of your life again. And Amanda's." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I thought about all the times I'd wished for their love and approval, how much it had hurt to feel invisible. But I also thought about Amanda and me, the life we'd built together, and the way we'd learned to stand on our own. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice even. They nodded, clearly disappointed, and after a few more awkward pleasantries, they left. I sat in my office for a long time after that, staring out the window and trying to make sense of how I felt. When I told Amanda about it that night, she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Do you think they're serious? About wanting to make things right?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe. But even if they are, I don't think it changes anything. They can't undo the past." Amanda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's okay not to let them back in, you know? You don't owe them that." She was right. For so long, I'd carried this guilt, this feeling that I was supposed to forgive them, to fix what was broken. But sitting in that office with them, I realized something important. Forgiveness didn't have to mean reconciliation. I could acknowledge their apology without letting them back into my life. Amanda and I had worked too hard to build what we had. We'd found strength in each other, and in the life we'd created. The scars from our past would always be there, but they didn't define us anymore. In the end, I sent my parents a short email. I told them I appreciated their apology, but that I needed time and space to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough for now. As our business continued to grow, and we kept helping others find their own paths, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. My past might have shaped me, but it didn't control me anymore. For the first time, I felt like I was finally free.